Hello everyone, I'm Kyle. Today we're going to be talking about general principles for how we learn. The reason why I wanted to give this is part of our coach development program, so all of our coaches are onboarded with these principles. So this gives you a better idea of what we're actually going for in this course. And more than that, you can use this knowledge to sort of augment how you learn in this um, in this program, and also how you can better teach other people. So I understand that a lot of you are going to train your underclassmen in your own debate organizations. So the purpose of this is to help you get started on that. Like, what kind of strategies can you use in order to better do that? And the first step towards creating those strategies is by learning how people think, how people learn actually. So the purpose of this lecture is to understand how students acquire and store knowledge, what limits a student's ability to learn new things, yourself included, how to minimize something called expert blindness. So if you have a lot of experience and your underclassmen don't have a lot of experience, how can you bridge that gap? And lastly, how do you improve your relationship as a teacher or as a coach to your students? So here's a suggested reading that we have for this time, which is John Hattie's Visible Learning and the Science of How We Learn. This is a highly recommended book. This is um, a meta-analysis. So what John Hattie and Gregory Yates did was they took a look at so many different studies and sort of collated them and condensed them and said, here are the trends that we found along all of these studies. So I take it on good authority that this person really knows what they're talking about. And the first thing that we need to realize is we need to confront a very difficult truth, which is that the mind is not really designed for thinking. It is constrained by a lot of factors. And the sooner that we accept this, the sooner that we can embrace the challenges that are going to be presented whenever we try to teach someone anything new. We are constrained by at least four factors. One is something called negativity bias. Another one is ease of access problems. Another one, which you are probably very, very familiar with, mind wandering. And lastly, gaps versus chasms. Let's take all of these up. So um, first, negativity bias. What we're trying to say here essentially is that learning is a negative experience. It often feels like a negative experience or an invitation to learn. Whenever someone says, hey, do you want to learn about quantum mechanics today, quantum physics today? Usually, most people say like, I mean, I do want to know about it, but I'm not sure if I have it in me to study and learn about it today. And that's because there's a difference between learning as the end result and the process of learning. So when you have like learning as the end result, that is a good feeling. Wow, I finally understand the theory of relativity. I finally understand how to have five arguments, five arguments after 3 minutes of prep time. But that is a good feeling, but it's completely different from the process of learning. In the process of learning, that's when you're like, oh man, I need to do some computations to understand the theory of relativity. So the process is not a good feeling. What you want is the end result, which is why a lot of us fantasize about, I wish that there was a time where I could just download information directly into my brain. And it's because learning requires effort. What we'd rather have is the end result without needing to put in any effort, right? But why is that bad? Um, Obviously, right, you need to put in effort. But we also have to understand that this isn't something that like we just choose to do because we're lazy, right? We have limited mental and cognitive resources in a day, and we can prove this through like biological standards. Like um, there's some stuff, glucose levels in the brain and stuff like that, and you see it fluctuate depending on how much effort we're making. Um, And that's the reason why, like, when you are putting in a lot of effort, like running on a treadmill or something, afterwards you tend to get lightheaded. Um, and that's because what we feel as consciousness, what we feel as, like, just thinking, that is directly tied to some actual thing that we have in the brain. And in order to make sure that we always have enough energy, we have evolved to be resource saving. So we tend to go like, I mean, I could spend resources on this, but I don't have all the resources in the world. So I'm only going to use it when I'm sure that's going to be worth it. So as a result, you see something like this. When you resist an invitation to think or to learn something, it's an economical decision. It's not one that's inspired by laziness. When you say, I'm not up to learning about um, quantum physics right now, it's not because you're lazy, but it's because you're not sure whether it's something that you need to learn about right now. You're not sure whether the effort that it takes is worth the information that you're going to have. Even though you're happy, that you would be happy if you learn it, you're not sure if the suffering that you're going to go through during the process of learning it will be worth it. So it's an economic decision. It's not laziness. Another thing that we need to take a look at is the idea of uncertainty. I already mentioned this earlier, but truly, when we learn so many different things, the odds are that we will not learn anything useful or great. The odds are you'll probably, like, use it in some instances, but it's not going to be something that changes your life. But we tend to value negative stimuli more than positive stimuli. This is the actual thing when we talk about negativity bias. It's we fixate on negative things more than positive things. So if you have like 20% of your day being bad and the rest of your day was pretty good, chances are when you like go back home, you're like, was this a good day? I would think it's probably like mid or maybe a negative day or a bad day. That's because of our negativity bias, right? So basically what we're saying here is that because we view it as a risk, we view it as a risk because it's probable that it's not really going to be useful. The result is that we tend to view the risk as being more important compared to the possible benefits that you might get, because we discount future benefits for today's unpleasantness. So let's take a look at these two premises again. So first, resisting an invitation to think is an economic decision, and the other one is learning something new is often too great a risk. So the most strategic response to an invite to learn is to just say no. So that's it for negativity bias. The question now is, how do we deal with negativity bias? What strategies can we take to make them invested in something that's perceived as risky, especially if you're just like a very new debate program? How can you get new members to come in and let go of that negativity bias? How can you, like, let's say they're already in the room, it's already their orientation, how do you really sell it to them? So we are constrained by two factors here, right? One is the reward is so far in the future and they're not sure if it's worth it. And secondly, it's very risky, right? So we need to take a look at reward and risk. So what we can do is, number one, we can heighten the reward promised so that it can overcome the bad. Because right now, people are not looking at the benefit in the future, right? That's the end result of their learning. What they're looking at is the process of learning and why it's so hassle. So what you want to do essentially is to heighten that reward at the end so that it can overcome the bad. So this is where you can talk about all the benefits of, it'll help you out with your college applications, it'll help you out with whatever, it'll help you out with wherever job you're gonna land in. So this can help sell it. But another thing that you might want to take a look at is this is a safe space. This is a safe space, and like we are very accommodating, and we're pretty cool, we're pretty funny. So that's part of the reward that makes the process less bad. Another one is to lessen the risk, because you can have so many good benefits in the long run, but it's still not going to be worth it, or you won't feel it's going to be worth it if it's like super long time frame, if it's a super long time frame. So what you can do is basically to say that, um, let's lessen the risk that it's something that won't be useful by making every lesson super useful. What you can do is structure your lessons in such a way that there will always be a real world application to this lesson. So you're lessening the risk of it being absolutely useless, by the time that you get to the reward at the end, by making sure that the journey towards that is littered with smaller rewards that are going to make it worth it in general. So let's move on to the next one, um, which is ease of access problems. So what we're talking about here is mental availability, the mind's ability to have appropriate information at hand and sufficient cognitive resources to deal with a problem. Basically, the problem here is this. You know it. You know that you know it. When you're taking an exam and you see something familiar, you're like, I know what the answer to this is, but I can't bring it to the front of my mind. Like, you need to think about it, and like ito yung mental block, right? The mental block happens when you know it, but you can't access it. So that's mental availability. The ability to have appropriate information at hand and sufficient cognitive resources to deal with a problem. And this can be one of the reasons why even adults procrastinate tasks that take up a little time to accomplish. It's not because you're lazy, it's not because we're lazy, but because the information is not immediately accessible and we have to spend effort digging up our notes on the task, remembering our process, etc. So that plus ego depletion, which we'll cover later, and burnout, which you might be familiar with, they all contribute to the idea of procrastination. So when information is not immediately accessible, people feel uncomfortable and less motivated to act. And that can partially explain why procrastination happens. Here's an interesting study, um, by Norbert Schwartz. As demonstrated by this guy, ease of access can produce very strange effects. So what he was answering or asking in this study to the right is a simple question. Does exerting more effort to recall memories affect your perception of yourself, how you view yourself? And the answer was yes. So the methodology was like this. He asked the participants of the study to remember and list down instances or events when they were assertive. But for half of them, they only needed to list down 6 times they were assertive. And for the other half, 12 times. Then, after they list down everything, they were asked to rate themselves based on whether they were generally assertive. For the half who recalled 6 instances of assertiveness, they mostly replied that they were more assertive. On the other hand, those who had recalled 12 instances replied that they were less assertive. Why is that the case? Because it is easy to recall 6 incidents. It is hard to recall 12. So if you have less access to information about your assertiveness, generally speaking, that less access to those memories leads you to believe that you are less assertive. Okay? So this is very important because when we're teaching kids, when we're teaching students, we also have to take a look at their mental state, like how they view themselves. So a lot of them will think about things like, I'm not smart enough to be a debater, or I'm too shy to be a debater. And that is because of all the times in their life when they were smart and they were not shy, even though like both of those things are like, even if um, there are lots of instances of them being not shy or them being smart, that can be like outweighed by the fact that they are more able to access or remember um, instances or um, cases when they were shy or not smart. So what does this mean? It means that what makes an experience meaningful to you is by the ease by which you can recall it. So, am I a kind person? Well, I can recall pretty easily the times when I've been kind. Therefore, I can say that yes, I'm a generally kind person. Or, well, I can recall pretty easily the times when I've been unkind. Therefore, I can say no, I more generally am unkind rather than kind. On the other hand, difficulty of recall is more important than the volume of memories recalled. Because if you ask someone to list down 3 times when they were kind and 3 times when they were unkind, they might still report that they are more kind if they have an easier time recalling those memories where they were kind and vice versa. So what can we conclude from these? It's a very important fact. Information that is hard to recall is unlikely to influence active thinking. Okay? And that does not just apply to debating, it applies to how you view yourself, it applies to how you manage the emotions and self-perceptions of your students. So if you apply it to a debate classroom with beginner level students, if they're trying to prepare for a motion about feminism and there's just one problem, they're from an all-boys school and generally they do not interact with girls or women, what tends to happen is if it is out of their cognitive reach, arguments about feminism are perceived as more difficult. So in my case, this was sports motions. We have a lecture about sports later on. But when the very first time that I debated, it was about sports. It was about um, whether or not schools should still have physical education classes. And I had absolutely no guidance. I had prep time, but on my own. Um, I didn't have a coach yet. And I sucked. I sucked so bad. It was such an unpleasant experience because I had no idea what I was talking about. Um, I had some information about PE, but not enough. And I even remember it. Like, I don't need notes during prep time. I was like, I don't need notes. I can be like, I can be like Ferdinand Marcos because Marcos was my idol back then. That was 13 years ago. Okay, I'm so sorry. But yeah, um, it was out of my cognitive reach. So as to why PE was difficult, was important. So as a result of that, sports motions in general seemed much more difficult to me, and I didn't like it. You might recall an instance in your own life where you first encountered an economics motion or an international relations motion, and you're like, oh my god, I have no idea what this is. And then all of a sudden, you start hating econ motions forever. So, your first memory, the easiest to recall memory about these kinds of motions, shape your perception of that class of motions in general, or your yeah, right? So if you combine it with what we know about negativity bias, it tends to create a worse experience for the student. It becomes very demotivating. Which leads to a question, which is in a student, in a situation where members of a class have less prior knowledge about feminism debates, how do we make them have a more positive experience with debating feminism motions? The answer for that is let's expand their prior knowledge. Let's expand their prior knowledge. Before they start the debate, let's have a short lecture about feminism. So a lot of the time, what we do is we make them do the debate first and then give the lecture. But that's the opposite of what studies tell us. Because if they have to fumble in the dark in the first instance, before you tell them what's going on, what they remember is the negative experience of fumbling in the dark rather than the positive experience of learning the real context. And as a result of that, it will taint the way that they see these kinds of motions forever, as opposed to them learning about it later and integrating that into their speeches moving forward. But then, I think the hesitation here for coaches is, if you make the lecture happen before the round, aren't I just feeding them the arguments? Well, there is a balance there, which is give them enough room to reach for the arguments. So when you're lecturing, you don't have to give them um, the entire argument, right? You can just give them the pieces that they would need in order to recreate the context that would be strategic in the debate. You don't need to like go all or nothing in the lectures. Sometimes you can half-ass it by design, because what you want to do is for them to have these pieces together so that they are able to reach out and get those arguments within using the cognitive resources that they have. And by the way, prior knowledge is super important. Prior knowledge is super duper important. The biggest predictor, or the most important aspect of whether a person will learn something fast is not like IQ, it's not, you know, your heart, it's not what you're born with, but it's the amount of prior knowledge that you have. So for a single lesson in science, let's say it's advanced physics. If you teach that lesson to someone who has no experience in physics, they'll be like, I have no idea. I have no idea. It'll take that person, let's say 3 days, to understand this one idea about advanced physics. But if you teach it to another person who has a PhD in applied physics, they are more likely to understand this idea in 3 hours or less, because this person has so much prior knowledge about physics already. And that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point I'm trying to say. That it's prior knowledge that expedites or makes faster the learning process. So if a person does not have enough prior knowledge, it'll be very uncomfortable for them to learn something new. What you want to do is you want to leverage your knowledge of their prior information and use it as a stepping stone, connect it to the new lesson that you are trying to teach. And by connecting it to their prior knowledge, not only will it be easier for them to understand, but it's also easier for them to integrate it within the framework of existing knowledge that they already have. So that's the reason why analogies are so important, metaphors are so important, especially for science communication, because science communicators know that most of their audience, they do not have a lot of prior knowledge about whatever field it is that they're going to be communicating, but they might have some knowledge about like the way balloons work or the way that, you know, coins work, stuff like that. That's the reason why they use the metaphor. It's to bridge the gap much faster. So, okay, so far, what we've seen is that learning is not something that we'd like to do. But there's a contradiction here, because if we don't like learning, why do we go down Wikipedia rabbit holes? Why do I have 50 tabs open literally right now? How do we reconcile the notion that we don't like learning with the fact that we are naturally curious? And the answer lies in realizing that we don't go down Wikipedia rabbit holes for every topic. We are curious about some topics, but not others. I'm curious about most things except sports. I recently went down a rabbit hole about the different breeds of sheep. So how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile that? We reconcile that by realizing that we are attuned to knowledge gaps, but we are not curious about knowledge chasms. That's a difference, right? Because I don't know anything about sports. I have zero prior knowledge about sports. So if you're going to ask me to research about like the economics of player trading or something like that right now, I will not be able to answer you. It's not something that stokes my curiosity, right? Um, for me, that is a knowledge chasm. What we are attuned to is knowledge gaps. When you're scrolling through Wikipedia and you actually like the topic that you're reading up on, when you right-click new tab the links in the Wikipedia, the reason for that is, oh, I kind of want to learn more about this. It's a gap in my knowledge, and that makes me curious, right? So what you can see is like our brain or the knowledge that we have is one huge web. It's one huge web where like one idea is always connected to another and the idea is connected to another, so on and so forth. And by remembering not just the idea, the nodes, but their connections, we are able to become more curious about more things by connecting the things to everything else. The most curious people are the ones who recognize that all ideas are connected to other ideas. Here's a cool example. I'm not sure if you know about this, but when I found out about this in 2011, it blew my mind. So if you're on Wikipedia and you click the first link, the non-italicized, non-parenthesis link in every Wikipedia page, and you do that ad infinitum, you're going to end up in philosophy. You're going to end up in philosophy. So if you view knowledge, data as a map, a web, and you draw it out at the end of the Wikipedia data map, at the center of it is always philosophy. And even philosophy, if you click on the first link over and over again, it'll lead you back to philosophy. It's super interesting for me. um, so if you understand that all of them are connected and you are focused on bridging those gaps, it's less likely that you're going to view it as a chasm. But if you're going to start with something super advanced already and say, understand this right now, that's a knowledge chasm. It's not bridgeable within the short term. So we are tuned to one but not the other because of negativity bias. In other words, if you think about it like a person crossing a bridge, if the treasure or the reward is literally just there, it's very likely that they're going to say, ah, okay, let's do it. But if instead it was a long ass bridge, that kid will probably not do it because it's too long. That's a chasm. And they're not sure if whatever is in that treasure chest will be relevant or useful to their life. So, what does this mean? This is an analogy, but basically, what we can say is relevance, as in the relevance of the lesson, plus giving them the means to cross that gap creates motivation and curiosity. So based on this, what can we say? One is, it's super duper important to leverage a student's prior knowledge. Stuff that's already relevant to them, we need to relate to the debate topic. We also need to take them through the journey step by step. So the means to cross that bridge gets less overwhelming. So instead of you viewing it as like one long bridge, let's make it several destinations with a short bridge each. Yeah. So that's it for knowledge chasms. Next is mind wandering. Because there's a problem with that model, right? which is even if you take it step by step, there's a risk of information overload happening. At some point, no matter what you do, no matter how good you are, the students will get bored. There is a point of diminishing marginal returns here. The longer a lecture goes on for, the worse off the student will be towards the end of the class. And there needs to be a break. There needs to be a refresh. And that's why almost all classes take 1 to 2 hours per session. The admin knows that the kids get overloaded the longer the session goes on, which leads us to the final principle for why students don't like learning in school. Mind wandering. So we have something called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the automatic part of your brain. System 2 is the thinking slow and deliberate part of your brain. We'll take that up in a bit. Another thing we'll take up is what is the limit of mental vigilance at the high school level, and let's talk about some theories for why that is the limit. So basically, mind wandering is when you get bored and look for something else to do. My mind wandered a lot while making this PowerPoint, by the way, and even while delivering the PowerPoint right now. So, System 1, System 2. System 1 is fast and automatic. It's your inner robot. It's able to immediately impact the present. System 2 is slow and deliberate. It's your conscious self. It's able to operate on a more extended time frame. So with practice, things that used to make you use System 2 become more and more automatic, engaging System 1 more and more. That's why at some point you become an expert. How do you explain to students how to create arguments from thin air as soon as you see the motion? Usually, the answer that your coach will give you is experience, just practice, which is true. Because with practice, with experience, thinking about motions becomes more of a system, thinking about arguments for emotion becomes more of a System 1 thing. So, but even if it is true, for the kid at the tournament right now, that advice isn't super helpful, and we'll get back to that. By the way, if you want to learn more about System 1 and System 2, go look up Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But anyway, why do we resort to ChatGPT? It's because as System 2 gets exhausted, we crave more automatic things to conserve energy, which we can relate to the idea of negativity bias, where we've evolved to be energy-saving creatures. So we end up wanting, or actually needing, something automatic, something that doesn't take up much effort. So in a debate class, you're going to see bored kids. That's natural. In fact, right, the reason why a lot of people, my theory is, the reason why a lot of kids use ChatGPT to cheat on their homework is because it's homework. They're so tired from school. They want to rest. So because they want to rest, they're like, yeah, why don't I just do ChatGPT for this? That's why I don't want to assign homework in general, especially the ones that you can do ChatGPT on. But in the worst case where I do homework, I tend to give homework that, is fun for them to answer. It's not something like, this will make or break your grade or anything like that. It's natural to see bored kids. But how long is the limit of mental vigilance of high school students? The answer is 15 to 20 minutes. Some even say 10 minutes, but I think it's more like 15 or 20. So mental vigilance is when you pay close attention to something and you don't pay attention to anything else. That's mental vigilance. So it'll take at most 15 to 20 minutes before before a student goes like, yeah, I'm gonna look outside the window right now. I'm gonna go daydream right now. And that's a fact that we have to deal with. It's not something that they can control, right? What we can do is think about why this happens and not blame them, not consider them lazy when they daydream. There are 3 possible situations situations. One is redundancy effect. It's when they say, oh, I already know that. Since they already know that, they don't pay attention. And when they come back, they're too far ahead already. I can't keep up anymore. It's a knowledge chasm to me now. I'll study this later when I get home. And then I never study it because it's a knowledge chasm to me. And then at some point it becomes, what's the point of even going to class? If I go, I won't get it. If I don't go, at least I can catch up. But because it's a knowledge chasm, I'll probably not study it. That's a story of how I never attended any of my econ classes in college. That's 100% true. One time I went to class and my classmates actually took photos of me and tweeted about, oh, there's a rare Pokemon in class. So that's the redundancy effect. So you have to make sure that when you gauge a student's prior knowledge, take a look at the limits of that prior knowledge as well. So if they know the basics of an argument, they can get bored, their mind will wander at that part. It's redundant for them to spend more time focusing on it. But when there's a part where you think they don't know about it, we've reached the limits of their prior knowledge, call them out. Ask them to pay attention. Alright? Don't shame them for not paying attention. That's very important. So that's a redundancy effect. Another one is ego depletion. Ego depletion is a failure of self-regulation. And that's your ability to focus intensively literally runs out through biological exhaustion. I mentioned this earlier, but this is indexed by glucose levels available to the brain. So it's necessary to conserve your energies for the next trial that's coming up in the future. So in this theory, mind wandering is an adaptive strategy for conservation of one's resources. The other theory that we want to talk about is cascading inattention. So this reflects the role of information overload in preventing the mind from following the story being told. Information overload happens because the mind really wants things to be simple. It wants to make a system or organize information in a simple way. But the amount of information that's being given implies that this information is very complex. So the mind strives for simplicity, the input demands or implies complexity. In practice, this creates overload because the mind keeps trying to organize it and it cannot keep up. So you can either slow it down, or what you can do is to pre-structure it so that the mind has an easier time structuring it after they receive the information, right? So in all of these theories, depletion and confusion, they suggest the same thing. Student attention deteriorates over the course of a lesson. One study found that halfway through lectures, 55% of students will report yes when asked if they are mind wandering at the time. Another study found that good students are able to regulate their attention, tuning in and tuning out of classes or lectures throughout the entire lecture, right? So it's self-regulation. You want to give yourself a break, even for just a few seconds, and then you come back, right? So whenever you find your mind wandering, what you want to do is let your mind wander, but then remember, we need to come back at some point. Don't be like super into the mind wandering thing. You need to realize what it is that your brain is doing so that you can stop it before it gets worse. Okay, so here are some questions. What is the effect to a class where only 1 or 2 people get called on and they have to recite for the whole session? So in law school, what can happen is, let's say that you have a class of 20 people, only 2 people get called, and then they have to recite for the entire hour. So when that happens, it's much more likely that other students will not want to recite. Not only will they not want to recite because they don't want to be humiliated or anything, they'll get anxious also because what if it's me? What if it's me? And then After that, they're just like, why do I have any incentive to listen to the reciter when I can just study on my own? Okay, if you accept the ego depletion theory as true, which is about energy conservation, how do you make sure that students pay attention when it matters? This is when you can call their attention, right? Observe them and call their attention. If we accept cascading inattention, that is, increasing complexity makes people want more simplicity and daydreams instead, how do you respond? We can respond this quite easily. We can pre-structure it, give an outline, give them the outline, stuff like that. Just so that you prime their brain or their mind to structure things before they even receive the input. Okay, so we've learned a lot about the brain and what it's not good for. It's not good for, accepting invitations to learn. And so far, we've just been creating strategies to move around cognitive limitations. But that begs the question, what is the brain even for? And this is where I want to talk about the social brain hypothesis. Under the social brain hypothesis, we have big brains because you have very complicated social systems. We need to remember millions of faces, and we can remember millions of faces. We have to remember a lot of symbols. We need to remember a lot of rituals and cultural practices. So, what does this imply? It implies that we learn better in a social context. For our role as teachers, remember that teachers are often considered to be second parents. And that is more real than we realize because our parents were our first teachers. They're the first people with whom we created social bonds. And those social bonds helped us learn more about the world. And that's the same thing that we're trying to replicate as teachers. Not like call me mama or call me papa, right? But literally, like, you need to understand that your role is much bigger than you might think. You are not just there to, okay, it's not just a transactional thing where, okay, here's some information, you're welcome, bye. It's you like nurturing a person, right? For the role of classmates, the social brain hypothesis makes it so that people are more easily able to learn things if they can apply it immediately to their social context. And that's the reason why like social cues are quite easy for many people, not everyone, many people to remember, even though no one got like formal schooling about social cues. And that's because those social cues needed to be learned in order to fit in with a certain social community as a general rule. There are some exceptions, right? But the role of classmates is you want to interact with your classmates more, okay? We need you guys to interact with each other. And that's because the learning gets reinforced when you realize it as something that can help you be closer with your friends, with your soon-to-be friends, right? For debating in general, the social brain hypothesis is very important for debating in general. Because what we're trying to do is the social brain thrives on discussions between peers. So learning happens better when it's done through discussions with peers. And that's what debating is all about, discussions with your peers. And finally, for the rules of System 1 and System 2, the brain is there because it wants to make it so that these social interactions, these learnings, get relegated to System 1. And System 2 can be all about learning new rituals, new faces, new whatever, right? So, okay. I guess I can skip this, but let's talk about it a little bit. Do students like school or class? The answer here is actually no, or, well, we're sure that they don't like it, but it's not that they don't like it either. So around 25% of students say that they don't like school. The vast majority of them say that they neither like nor dislike school. But all of them who answer that they like the parts that they like about school, the social aspects, yung sagot nila. Um, the Dr. Willingham was the person who said that the mind isn't designed for learning. So the question is, what professional issue were they addressing? And the answer to that is the idea of laziness. What you were trying to answer is why do these kids seem lazy? Um, and the answer is they're not lazy. They're not lazy. It's just their brain. So it's actually a you problem as a teacher because you failed to relate it to things that they really liked. In relation to cognitive load and ego depletion, an invitation to think or learn implies what? It implies a very risky exertion or spending of limited cognitive resources. In relation to mental availability, how does this concept work against our educational goals? If they have a prior belief in their own shyness or in their own dumbness, and it's very easy for them to access memories where they were dumb or when they were shy, it's very difficult for us to correct that. So these are things that we might need to reinforce, or these are things that we might need to take their focus away from by focusing our praise not on, oh, you're so smart, oh, you're so confident now, ganyan. Instead of focusing our praise on those things, I think a better approach might be shift your attention away from ego, because confidence, whether you think you're smart or dumb, that's an ego thing talking. It's not about the task. So shift their attention away from their ego and towards more about how they can do the task better. And then they can develop their ego around that early, like on their own as well. Um, what factor constrains a person's natural curiosity? It is lack of prior knowledge. And the purpose of the initial get to know you session, and this is the reason why we had the get to know you session last Tuesday, was because the purpose of the initial get to know you session is to assess the student's prior knowledge and their interests so that we can better connect it to the following lessons. Um, okay, there's an expert blind spot effect, which is, let's say that you're very experienced. There might be a barrier to teaching. So while you can't teach something that you don't know anything about, being an expert may be a barrier to teaching because experts often underestimate task difficulty for novices. So Pamela Hinds in 1999 conducted a study about expert phone users. It's 1999, there are expert phone users. Um, and they were asked, okay, how long do you think it will take for a non-phone user to learn about how to use a phone? And they were like, a couple of days. And they severely underestimated it because the novice phone users took much longer than that to actually learn the thing. Another thing is experts can be poor in queuing and communicating because experts possess knowledge that is well organized but only encapsulated in the ways that can be understood by people within the fields. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier with respect to the scientific community and science communicators. Science communicators are important because science experts are often poor in communicating it because their well-organized knowledge only is understandable to people within the field. So science communication is important because you need to bridge the gap so it can be understood by people outside the field. And lastly, experts might be able to do things but not understand why or how to do them. So this is the problem when you say just practice, just practice. It's more effective to consciously try to break down your process into actionable steps that can help a student check whether they're doing well or not. So people ask me like, how do you weigh things? And like just the old me, the younger me would say, just practice on it, like force yourself to do it. And that's because I'm able to do it, but not really understand how to do it. So I consciously try to break it down and say, okay, here are the things that you need to do it. Here are 4 steps for you to do it. Here are some standards that you can use for weighing, stuff like that. Okay, Here are some principles of knowledge acquisition. The first is that learning requires time, effort, and motivations. Next one is that concentration spans are short. The third one is distributed practice is more effective than cramming. Next is prior knowledge effects are powerful. The mind responds well to multimedia output, and that learning requires active engagement with the lesson. So, time, effort, and motivation. So learning is a slow process, takes months and years rather than months or days. Days or weeks, I'm sorry. So here are the ingredients for that. You need time for them to internalize the lesson. You need to orient them on their goals. You need to give supportive feedback. You need to have accumulated successful practice, and you have to make them frequently review their work. So a lot of most people overestimate their ability to learn. They overestimate it. And the reason why that happens is we confuse the idea of learning, which is integrating it fully into our body of knowledge that we have, and understanding something or processing it. We can process isolated bits of knowledge in a short time frame, but we forget it. That's not the same as learning. If you forget it, you have not fully learned it. Okay? If it's just processed and you didn't integrate it in the body of knowledge that you have in your brain, that's not learning. That's the reason why we overestimate our ability to learn, because we confuse processing with learning. Okay? Unless the material is strongly relevant, strongly meaningful, super timely, we will rapidly forget it. So another thing that we need to mention is learning is not a straight line. Every session you fight against rapid forgetting. So don't be frustrated as a coach if you have to repeat yourself. And as a student, don't be frustrated if you keep forgetting or if you keep needing to relearn it. The fact is, if you learn something once and then you forget it, studies have shown that the second time that you learn it, it'll be much faster. The next thing I want to talk about is how short concentration spans are. As I mentioned, 15 to 20 minutes before significant levels of mind wandering. If you want to teach someone something new, do it within 15 minutes or else you'll lose them. So we need to rethink the way that we do lectures. Break them into chunks with one big idea each. Make sure you can fit every section into a 15 to 20 minute chunk. The mind doesn't need a complete break, only a break from the lecture. That's the reason why we daydream and we think about something else. We watch a movie in our heads. We didn't stop thinking. So our brains aren't really getting a complete break. What they only need is a break from the lecture. So what you can do is maybe like the first lecture chunk and then 5-minute break to do some sort of exercise or to just rest, and then do your second lecture chunk. We're not implementing that for this session because it's an asynchronous session. You can literally take breaks whenever you want. Okay, but we highly encourage all of our coaches to give 5-minute breaks whenever they can. Okay, distributed practice is better than mass practice. The reason why this is a course that takes place over 12 sessions, 2 months, is because we believe that, actually we know that distributed practice is better than mass practice. We could have made it so that we have 2 days only and we have 12-hour days both days, right? It might be the same number of hours. The problem is, to try to learn material within a single block of time is less effective than if the same duration of time is broken into shorter periods spaced over several days or weeks. This is a distributed practice effect. So it can be especially true if you're developing new procedural skills like driving a car, and making sure your speech follows a structure. These procedural skills make you do a lot of things at the same time. So it's really about how you feel it. You need to feel your way going through it. Like, you know that when you're driving a car, you need to pull down the handbrake and then step on the clutch and then step on the and then do the thing and then do the thing and do the thing. And like that's a lot to remember. But it's easier when you're spacing out your practice and you're doing it and you're doing it and you're doing it such that you can just end up feeling it and it's more automatic by the end. And that's the same thing with making sure your speech follows a structure. You have to consciously and deliberately practice at it and space out the practice over a few days or a few weeks, and then by the end it becomes more or less automatic to you. But the crux is on you here. You need to make sure that when you're practicing, it's deliberate. You are thinking about the steps that it takes to drive a car. You're thinking about the parts of the argument. You're thinking about the things that are needed for your structure to work. All right? So that's it. The effects of distributed practice is sometimes called the spacing effect. Next, prior knowledge effects. A major determinant of knowledge acquisition is prior knowledge. According to the social brain hypothesis, we keep what's relevant to our community, and we integrate new knowledge to our existing mental frameworks with our prior knowledge acting as a filter for whether the new information is relevant. So, for debate coaching, ask the students to connect it to something they already know. Use the get to know you part wisely. I'm pretty sure that some coaches did some sort of diagnostic test. I heard that one of the coaches did a word search, which is amazing because if you are already familiar with certain words, you can find them more easily on a word search puzzle. It can be a diagnostic test like making everyone take the political spectrum quiz, stuff like that. The mind craves structured data. So overviews are important as advanced organizers. It primes the mind to understand in advance how it should structure the incoming info. So this is what I was talking about earlier with regard to cascading in attention. Next, multimedia output. A lot of people say that I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner. That is true, but it's also false. What do I mean by this? It is true that some people prefer some senses being simulated over others. But lab studies reveal that we learn better, everyone learns better when the inputs we experience are multimodal, when it engages the most amount of senses possible. So our brain integrates information from different source inputs. So some students learn better marginally through words. Some people learn marginally better through sounds. Some students learn marginally better through pictures. But the most effective thing to do is to connect words, images, and sounds together. Which is why, right, it's not enough to just give the PowerPoint. You need to, have some pictures and stuff. You need to have someone here talking. Yeah, the most effective thing to do is to connect it all together. So it means we need to do more effort on our PowerPoints. We need to design our lessons so that it's about them experiencing things and link everything to their prior knowledge. Okay, active engagement. Passive engagement can help you learn. This is just like, okay, let me just listen and take down notes. Actually, no, let me just listen, right? It's risky because sometimes you're just taking down notes and you don't realize you don't understand anything that you're writing. Or you get distracted or you fall asleep. So passive engagement can help you learn, but it's risky. Merely listening helps you observe more information, but active engagement helps you retain the information that you observed. So what I do is I encourage students to do crime. This is a joke, and it's so memorable because when I say just do crime, it's chunking, recital, imagery, mnemonics, and elaboration. Chunking is, okay, you have a lot of new information, try chunking it so that you group them together based on themes, and you can do the themes yourself. You're actively making them engage with the information. The second one is recital, which is, okay, can you repeat in your own words what we just learned about? Recital, or you can encourage them, okay, after the class, while you're just alone or something, recite it to yourself. Recite it to yourself. Try looking at the thing, look at your notes, look away, and then recite while looking away. Imagery is try to picture it in your head. And this works for some people better than others. So there are some people who can, honestly, they're so cool. They can memorize phone numbers, and after seeing them like for a few seconds, they're able to read it forwards and backwards. And apparently what they do is they look at it and then they take a photo of it with their brain, and then they project the photo onto a wall with their mind, and then they read it forward and backward. It's amazing. It's really amazing. So there, imagery. Uh, in debate, what you can do is when you're teaching a concept, when you're trying to learn a concept, think about like how would this work in real life. Try to imagine it happening to a regular Joe. Mnemonics, that's our self-explanatory. I think mnemonics like crime is super helpful, right? Because it's like, in order to actively engage, you need to do crime. Or another one that we will take up in the coach development program is the DIE model, which is how do you develop your teaching style depending on like the different kinds of students. The DIE model, it stands for diagnosis, intervention, implementation, and evaluation. So when I say, if you want to learn how to teach better, you need to be prepared to die. And just like mnemonics are so interesting because like it's very impactful and helps you remember things. And finally, most importantly, elaboration. Elaboration happens when here's a new piece of information, elaborate on it by putting in some of your own information. Some information that you already have, related to something you already know. Or, using your own words, expound on this, right? So, all of these steps you can use to encourage students to engage actively with the material. So if you're matter loading with the students, you can tell them, okay, here's what you can do. Whenever you see a new piece of matter, ask yourself, is this true? How does this affect me? What debates can we use this in? Can we find a counterexample? And by making them ask those questions, it makes them um, more likely to remember it because they're actively engaging with the material. Yeah, so what if the student is quite privileged? Because I put here, how does this affect me? How do you ask, how does this affect me if the student is a bit more privileged? You can do like an empathy exercise. Like, who will be affected by this news? What do you know about these people? If you were in their shoes, how would you feel? And you can guide them. They might not have some prior information about this, about these types of people, so maybe you can provide that prior knowledge to them. Okay, handling information overload is the last slide. Most students possess a tendency towards overconfidence in being able to learn. And I mentioned this earlier, the misconception is that learning is about understanding information in the first instance rather than being able to recall it in the long run. So, when you're coping with overload, you need to have strategies that can either increase your opportunities to learn or manage our emotional response. So, if it's about increasing opportunities to learn, it can be stick to a schedule, or, this is my preferred one, teach someone else. If you teach someone else, that's an opportunity for you to learn and remember it. You can also manage your emotional response. What do you do when you're frustrated during your class? For example, this is what happened to me, real property taxation by local government units. What I felt was an absolute amount of frustration and contempt for this subject, and I channeled it into like, this professor thinks that they can this professor thinks that their absurdity will escape me. So I was hate studying it because I wanted to see how absurd this system could go. um, because I was like, I leaned into it. I leaned into the emotional response. Another thing you can do is when you are overwhelmed by just like the sheer amount of tasks that you need to do some mindfulness exercises. You can meditate on it a little bit. Try to remember that it only seems overwhelming because you're viewing it as a huge blob. But if you break it down into parts, it becomes a little bit more manageable. So manage our emotional responses. If it's something that you can utilize into like working harder, like in my case on real property taxation, do that. Um, my father also does something like this when he would channel his anger over the subject or over the teacher into studying harder for that class. But if it's something that you cannot use towards it, like every second that I spend studying this makes me feel worse about myself, don't utilize that. Okay, what would be better is try to reframe your emotional responses. Like, is this really me, or is this just my perception of myself? Is this the real me, or is this just my limiting self-beliefs? Okay, but here are some sources of overload. It can be low levels of prior knowledge, because if you don't have a lot of prior knowledge, everything will seem overwhelming to you. Inappropriate or ineffective coping strategies. Another thing is unrealistic expectations. Unrealistic expectations. We think that we're gonna be super awesome after a few hours. No, you're not. You're already awesome, but not specifically at this thing. It will take a few years. Not really a few years. It'll take a while. So uh, don't treat yourself as just some sort of robot that can learn something really, really fast. Because you're not like that. The beauty of it is we thrive despite, right? We thrive despite. So don't have unrealistic expectations, but embrace the challenges. Because if you have unrealistic expectations for yourself, you will still make the same number of mistakes. But you will beat yourself up more for those mistakes. So what's good is you have a realistic expectation that's not too hard, but not too easy either. It's challenging. It's challenging. You will make the same mistakes, but embrace that challenge and know that it's not a statement about you as a person. It's a statement simply to say that you are still learning. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Mistakes are a good thing. Challenge is a good thing. Because that is the first step towards learning. When you make a mistake, your brain sends a message to you that it's called an error negativity or error positivity response. There are two signals that are sent. And both of them signal to you that you should pay more attention to this experience. And the disjunct between what you thought you knew and what the reality was, it creates something called disequilibrium. And because you're signaled by your brain to pay more attention to this is a time when learning is more likely to happen. When you're dispelling misconceptions. Okay, so making mistakes is good. Making mistakes is good. Embracing challenges is good. Failing is good. Okay? We don't have grades here because we don't really care about grades. What we care about is your ability to learn and your experience while learning. And that really means that we need to create a more positive relationship with failure, with making mistakes. Okay? Another source of overload is poor instruction, inadequate teaching, failure to actively engage, and assessment apprehension. Assessment apprehension happens when there's a test that's given to you and you feel apprehensive about the test being given because you feel like it's unfair or it doesn't mean anything, grades don't define me, there's unhealthy levels of competition. Assessment apprehension. It can lead to overload. It can also lead to denial in the case of grades don't define me because they don't define you, right? But your ability to remember and understand things that defines not you, but your state of learning for this lesson. Okay, so that's it for this asynchronous session. We actually have 2 more sessions under the coach development program, but that's for the coaches already. This is just a preview